guys, welcome to CADS 3853 Module 5. In the previous 4 modules, we've talked a lot about how a business's goal is to maximize profits and what impacts a profit of a business, such as net sales, cost of goods sold, and operating expenses. And also we talked about why it is important to keep track of profits. In this module, we're going to start a new unit of the textbook, Unit 2, which is about retail pricing. Pricing decisions include markup decisions and markdown decisions. In this module and next 5 modules, we'll focus on markups, and then the next 2 modules will deal with markdowns. This module, Module 5, specifically will explain the basics of markups. When it comes to deciding on the prices of an item, there are 3 basic components that we have to think about. Okay? One is retail, another is cost, and the other is markups. Retail is the selling price of the merchandise to the consumer, so, how much the consumer is supposed to pay for the merchandise. Cost is the billed cost of the merchandise to the retailer, so how much the retailer actually paid to the vendor to obtain this merchandise. Okay? And markup is the difference between the retail and the cost. The markup should be decided so that it is large enough to cover the operating expenses and the profit goal and any possible reductions in price, such as markdowns or discounts and things like that, as well as any shortages that you may have in your inventory. The relationship among the retail cost and markups, RCM, is what we call RCM relationship. It's pretty simple. It is expressed in an equation, retail equals cost plus markup. So that means because markup is the difference between retail and cost, okay, if you add markup and cost, that should be your retail price. From this RCM relationship, we can easily derive 2 more formulas. Markup equals retail minus cost, and cost equals retail minus markup. This basic RCM relationship is applicable to both dollar figures and percent figures. So in terms of dollars, this would be expressed as retail dollars equals cost dollars plus markup dollars. For percentage figures, all the percentages are a percent of retail. Okay, so that makes retail always 100%. So that would be 100% or retail percent equals cost percent plus markup percent. The cost percent being cost dollar divided by retail dollar because it's a percent of retail. Your denominator is the retail. And markup percent is the same way. It's markup dollar over retail dollar. Again, percent of retails. So let's use this RCM equation in this example problem number 1. A vendor offers you a handbag that costs $47.5. So that's the cost, and has a suggested retail price of $100. So that $100 being the retail. Let's determine the markup in both dollar and percent. Let's pause the video here and work on the problem on your own for a while. Let's take a look at the answer. Okay, so instead the problem says cost is 47.5, so you put the cost 47.5 under the cost dollar sale, and the retail was $100. If you use this grid, that will be retail dollar sale. And since retail equals cost plus markup, you can easily calculate the markup dollar by subtracting cost dollar from retail dollars. $100 minus 47.5 would be $52.5 of markup. And markup percent will be percent of retail, so you have to divide your markup dollar by your retail dollars. 52.5 divided by 100, that will be 52.5%. So this problem basically demonstrates the case where we know our retail and cost in dollars, and we're supposed to find markup percent. Okay, and we went through a 2-step calculation to reach our markup percent. The first step was to calculate markup dollar from the retail and cost dollars, and then you convert that into percentage by dividing the markup dollar by retail dollar. And this is a very common merchandising problem. A lot of times we kind of have an idea about what retail price this item should be, selling in my store. And then you go to market and you find this an item that with this certain cost, and you want to see what markup you want to be able to achieve if you bought this item at that cost and sell the item or retail the item at the suggested retail price that you're thinking about in your head. And that is a very typical problem. So I call this one of the 3 most frequently used pricing or markup problem cases in the industry, and I call that case number 1, and we'll take a look at it next slide. So case number 1 is when we know retail and cost in dollars, and we need to figure out markup percent from them. Okay, then we have one simple formula that combines this 2-step calculation procedure, and markup percent equals R minus C over R. Okay, R dollar, retail dollar, minus C dollar, cost dollar, divided by R dollar. I minus C over R. Okay, try to remember this. This should be one of the important cases that you need to memorize. It should not be even on a formula sheet. You should not have to go back and take a look at this formula to be able to answer quizzes or exams questions on this type of problem. It's just one of the most important, most frequently used formulas. It's going to be in this class. Okay, so let's take a look at another problem, example problem that is also based on the RCM equation, RCM relationship. Okay, so a buyer from the women's wear department plans to purchase their dresses to retail for $70. So that gives us the retail price, $70 each. And this department has a planned markup of 32%. Very typical case where you know how much you want to retail this item for, and you've got a markup goal, a planned markup goal. And now we have to figure out what would be the maximum allowable cost that we can pay to obtain this merchandise item, this dress in this case. It's a very typical merchandise problem. Let's first figure out where to put the given numbers in this grid, right? So since we know that retail equals cost plus markup, we kind of put a grid like this. And then we know the retail price was supposed to be $70, and our markup percent is supposed to be 32%. So the question mark goes to that cost dollar, that cell. We're supposed to find what will be the maximum cost that we can pay to buy each of these dresses. Let's work on this after pausing the video for a while. Okay, well, let's take a look at the answer. I hope you remember that retail is always 100%. Because retail is 100%, your cost percent can be easily calculated by knowing what the markup percent is. So 100% equals, retail percent equals cost percent plus markups, right? So the cost percent will be retail minus markups, so 100% minus markup percent of 32%. So that gives us a cost percent of 68%, 68% of retail, right? So then next step will be to finally figure out the cost dollar. By knowing that cost percent is 68% of retail, you have to multiply retail dollar, $70, by your cost percent, 68%, and that gives us the cost of 47.6. Okay, so this is the maximum cost that we can pay for us to be able to make a 32% markup by selling this item for $70 at retail. Okay, so you can pay all the way up to $47.6 to buy this dress, and if you can sell it for $70 in your store, then you will be able to meet that 32% markup goal. So again, if you look at this case, this is the case where we know the retail dollar and markup percent, and then we are supposed to calculate cost dollar. Okay, so this is the second case, the second most frequently used markup, cost, retail calculation cases in the industry, where we know the retail dollar and markup percent, and we're supposed to figure out how much we can pay at cost. Okay, in that case, again, we went through two steps. We first had to calculate cost percent, which was 100% minus markup percent, okay, which is the part that is in the parentheses, in this case 2 formula. And then we had to time that by the retail dollar to be able to come up with our cost dollar, right? So we put these two steps into one formula here. It says cost dollar equals retail dollar times 100% minus markup percent. Okay, so when we see this type of problem where we know the retail dollar and markup percent, and we're supposed to calculate cost dollar, do not try to figure things out almost step by step, and then you have to instantly remember, okay, this is the case, one of the RCM case. We know the R and M, we're supposed to find the C, so the C dollar equals R dollar times 100% minus markup percent. R times 100% minus markup percent. Okay, again, remember this formula. Okay, so here's another problem. This is again demonstrating one of the most frequently used cases in merchandising problem. A t-shirt buyer purchased a group of t-shirts that cost him $5.50 each. So here again, it's showing the cost with a markup of 48%. So we know the cost and markup. Okay, what's the retail price for each t-shirt? Okay, so this is the case where we know the C and M, and we're supposed to figure out the R retail. Okay, let's see first. Let's try to plug in the given figures in this grid. We know the cost to be $5.50, so that will be the cost dollar sale. The markup is 48%, and that's the markup percent sale. And then the question mark goes to the retail price of this t-shirt, so that is retail in dollar. That question mark goes to that retail dollar sale. Okay, so let's figure out retail dollar from the cost dollar and markup percent. Let's pause the video here. Okay, let's take a look at the answer. Again, I hope that you remember that retail is always 100%. So that makes the cost 52% because markup was 48%. Cost plus markup should be 100%. So cost is 100% minus 48% markup. That is 52%. Okay. So that gives us the case where the cost dollar is $5.50 and the cost percent is 52%. And the $5.50 is 52% of the retail. Okay. So it's like $5.50 equals 52% times the retail dollar. Okay, from that you can derive the retail dollar formula kind of thing. So that will be like a cost dollar divided by cost percent. Okay, so that's $5.50 divided by 52%, and that will be $10.58. Okay. So again, we went through two steps. First, we had to figure out the cost percent by subtracting markup percent from the retail percent. And then we divided the cost dollar by the cost percent. So there's two steps of calculations. And we can combine those two steps into a single formula here when we know the cost dollar and markup percent. And we have to figure out the retail dollar from them. Retail dollar equals cost dollar divide by 100% minus markup percent. Again, that 100% minus markup percent represent the cost percent, and cost dollar divided by cost percent will be the retail because cost percent is cost dollar over retail dollar. Okay, so again, we see a variation of the RCM relationship. C, M are known, and R is supposed to be figured out. Okay, R equals C divided by 100% minus M percent. Okay, retail dollar equals cost dollar divided by 100% minus markup percent. This is the third case. That is one of the three cases that are most popular, most frequently used in the merchandising problems in the industry. So here we go. We are looking at the three cases on a single slide here. And all of these three cases are looking at the RCM relationship in a sense that we are given two of the RCMs and are supposed to figure out the rest. So the first case, We know our R and C in dollars, and we're supposed to calculate markup percent and percent. Then what would be the formula? Markup percent equals, yes, markup percent equals retail dollar minus cost dollar over retail dollar. So that markup percent is R minus C over R. In the next case, let's say we know the R and M, and we're supposed to calculate C. So retail and markup percent are known. Retail dollar and markup percent are known. We want to calculate cost dollar. In that case, cost dollar equals retail dollar times 100% minus markup percent, right? So C dollar equals R dollar times 100% minus M percent. Finally, the last case, when we know the C and M, and we're supposed to calculate R. Okay, when we know the cost, so when we went to the market, we know the cost, and we know our markup goal, percent goal. Okay, so then we have to figure out whether this item is going to give us enough retail price that is high enough to cover our costs and expenses, as well as also customers will be willing to pay. Right, so let's calculate the retail dollar. Retail dollar equals cost dollar divided by 100% minus markup percent. Okay? Retail dollar equals C divided by 100% minus markup percent. And this way we know what would be the minimum retail price we need to charge for us to be able to pay this cost and meet this markup percent goal. And we can kind of see if this retail price is high enough for us or low enough for the consumer to be willing to pay and things like that, to make a judgment about whether it is a good item to buy or not. So these are the three most important cases regarding the pricing or markup related merchandise problems that they are used so frequently. So it's just kind of around you all the time that you have to memorize these three formulas, and other formulas you may put them in a formula sheet or something like that for your quiz or exam. But these three equations are going to be used so frequently, and some of them are going to be used like more than one of them are going to be used in like one question, for example, that it will be a waste of time if you have to look back your notes to try to find these formulas and every time you have to use it. So memorize them to the core of your heart so that you can instantly record them whenever you need this type of formulas. And these are the formulas that you will have to remember even after this semester is over, throughout your career. I almost guarantee you, whether you're design major or merchandise major, it doesn't matter, whichever major you are in, whichever career path you're going to go through after graduation, these are the RCM is the concept that you have to continue to use in costing your design if you're a designer, or when you're buying if you're a buyer, merchandise planner and product line planners, and all the way through all kinds of professions. And these are the formulas that are not only applicable to this particular module, but these formulas are going to be revisited multiple times throughout the remaining semesters in various occasions. We are going to need to know markups for inventory planning, open-to-buy planning, assortment planning, and all those kinds of planning and control in merchandising. So these are totally worth memorizing. Okay, well, this next problem is basically, well, we want to practice one of the three cases again. And in this case, it's we're talking about buying a dozen pairs of socks. So a lot of times, especially like low cost items, they may not be sold in unit level, so you can't really buy one unit of socks. We're talking about a retail buyer buying from vendors kind of case. But the vendors are going to market or sell these items at like a packet of dozen units, or a packet of 3 units or something like that. So kind of think about it in that kind of case. Let's say a dozen pairs of socks retail for $6.50 per pair. So for each pair of socks, it's going to be $6.50. Okay, and you want to carry a markup of 46.8%. Okay, what did the buyer pay for the dozen pairs of socks? So it's asking how much the buyer paid, so that is about cost, right? So this is the case where we know the retail dollar and markup percent, and we're supposed to figure out the cost. So that's kind of case number 2 that we just looked at. So I hope that you remember the formula, okay? But remember that these pricing, so the $6.50 is per pair, so per unit, okay? Whereas you have to figure out the cost for dozen pairs of socks. Let's pause the video here and work on the problem. So let's take a look at the answer. My recommendation is to start with the big numbers. So instead of $6.50 for retail, let's go over the dozen retail amount for the dozen pairs, because we have to find out the cost for dozen pairs anyway. So dozen pairs of socks will be retailed for $6.50 per pair times 12. Dozen means 12 units, right? So that would be $78 for the dozen pairs of socks, retail dollar for dozen pairs of socks. Then we had the markup percent of 46.8%, so that is C equals R times 100% minus markup percent, so that will be $78 retail dollar times 53.2%, which is 100% minus markup percent, right? So 78 times 53.2% will be 41.5. So $41.50 will be the cost that the buyer has to pay for the dozen pairs of socks. Some of you might have wanted to find out the cost dollar per pair or unit first, and then you time that by 12. And if you wanted into that approach, you would probably find the unit cost, that is cost dollar per pair or unit, was $3.46. Again, retail times 100% minus markup percent. So retail per pair was $6.50 times the 100% minus markup percent is 53.2%, and that will be $3.46. And then you time that by 12, so that you can calculate the cost dollar per dozen pairs of socks, and that way you can probably find $41.52. There's a little bit of difference between this answer and the previous answer on the previous slide because of the rounding error. So this is probably a reason why I would go for the method that I introduced you on the previous slide. So you kind of have the retail dollar for entire dozen first, and then you calculate the cost dollar per dozen instead of calculating cost dollar per unit, and then you time that by 12 to get the dozen, because there's a rounding error involved. In this case, like 2-cent error. Okay, let's do another practice problem. This is a case that is different from the cases that we've seen so far, because this is the case where we know the markup percent. So this buyer, Mrs. Jones, planned a 45% markup. So we know the markup percent. And she has just ordered a shipment and figured that the items will bear a $22.50 markup. So it's like we know the markup dollar. And then we want to figure out what will be the retail and the cost for each item. So if you have to use this type of grid, then let's figure in all the numbers that we already know, right? We first know our markup percent, so that's 45% markup percent. And the markup dollar is given, so $22.5 markup dollar, okay? Another piece of information that we know that was not mentioned in the problem is that the retail percent is always 100%, so you can put 100% there, right? So knowing this, let's figure out what will be the retail price dollar, retail dollar, and cost dollar. Alright, let's take a look at the answer together. Okay. In this case, the first step is to first figure out what the retail dollar is. Okay. Given that the markup dollar is 22.5 and markup percent is 45%, and we know that markup percent is percent of retail, right? So that means 45% equals the markup dollar 22.5 divided by your retail dollar. Okay. If you solve this equation for retail, then retail will be markup dollar over markup percent. Okay, so that's where you get the retail of $50. Markup dollar divided by markup percent, so that's 22.5 divided by 45%. If you solve this problem, that will be $50. Once you know your retail dollar, then you can easily calculate a cost dollar by knowing the RCM relationship. Retail equals cost plus markup. So retail is $50, markup was 22.5. That means the cost is the difference between the retail and markup, 27.5, $27.50. Okay, so there was a little bit of a tricky part in first figuring out the retail dollar. But if you know what the markup percent actually meant, the fact that the markup percent is markup dollar divided by retail dollar, then you should be able to easily calculate retail dollar from that concept. So far we have taken a look at the RCM relationship in pricing. Okay, the relationship between the retail price and the cost basically determines the gross margin. Okay, if you think about it at the store level, okay, the combination of all the retail prices of all the items that you sold are basically what we call net sales, right? And the cost of the merchandise, if you combine all the costs that you pay to the vendor for all the items that you sold, that's what we called cost of goods sold in the previous module. And we know that net sales minus cost of goods sold determines the gross margin, right? So in that sense, each individual item's retail price and the cost determines eventually our gross margin. If we have a high markup, which means the difference between retail price and cost is high enough, then that will lead to our high gross margin, right? So the goal of pricing is really to increase or maximize our gross margin. And effective pricing will just get us to do that. You know, if you do price in the right way, so that is like the maximum the retail price that our customers will be willing to pay, okay, that will help us meet our gross margin goal. Okay, and by choosing the right price for the merchandise, we can help meet our sales volume goal. Okay, you know, we can sell as many as possible. We don't want to price too high or too low. Okay, and the effective pricing allows us to help cover our cost, the cost of goods sold, as well as the operating expenses, the non-merchandise related expenses or costs that we also need to pay, and you know, covering the cost, and what's left is going to be our profit. So we have to assure that our pricing will be effective enough to cover our cost and meet our gross margin goal, and will maximize our sales volume as well as give us our profit. Since the goal of pricing is increasing or maximizing gross margin, and pricing basically means determining the retail price, knowing your cost and your markup goal, you know, we have to think about what ways that we can actually increase our gross margin. And there are the multiple things when it comes to pricing. First, controlling markdowns. Okay? Decrease the amount of markdowns will increase the amount of gross sales as long as they don't decrease the sales volume, right? So don't use a 50% markdown when 30% markdown will do the job, for example. Okay? Another thing that we can think about in increasing gross margin is purchasing higher margin item. Higher margin basically means the items that gives a higher markup. Okay? Markup directly impacts gross margin. Okay, markup is the difference between retail minus cost, and gross margin is difference between net sales and cost of goods sold. You can see why. But margin, if you combine all the margin markups from every item that you sell, that is what we call gross margin, right? So buying a higher margin item, which means buying items that can give us a higher markup, and even if we charge a little bit higher retail price with a little bit higher markup percent, these items will still sell fine with our customers. Then those are the items that we want to buy. The next way to increase gross margin is merchandising for cross sales. Cross sale means basically you know, sales with of items that are complementary, so the customers like to buy them together. Okay, when customers buy this item, they tend to also buy the other items and things like that. And we can display them together so the customers understand the idea of coordination of these items. And if you buy a great new style of jeans, also purchase a top and a sweater to go with them and put them all together on the sales floor, so that maybe one of the items may be selling with a little bit lower markup, but the other items can sell in a higher markup. So you can kind of play around with the different markups for different items, so that you can eventually ensure that you will achieve the right kind of gross margin. Finally, we also have to think about the price sensitivities of the items. Price sensitivity basically means what will be the customer's reaction with an increase of the price. Okay, certain items, for certain items, customers are less price sensitive, whereas other items, the consumers may be very sensitive. Okay? So for those items that consumers are not so sensitive, which means even if you raise the price a little bit, their demand is not going to change. Their demand is not going to reduce. In that case, you want to increase the price, retail price, as high as possible. Right? If it is very price sensitive items, which means with a little bit of an increase in price, you're going to see a huge, big, deep drop in your demand sales. In that case, you want to price these kind of items appropriately. So you don't want to add an excessive markup on these kind of items. So you have to think about the price sensitivity of the items to apply different percentage markups. And obviously we want to add a higher markup percent for non-price sensitive items. All of these ways are some examples of kind of pricing tactics and pricing concepts that you can think about with the goal of increasing gross margin. In summary, let's remember that the pricing and determining the retail price and cost has direct impact on our gross margin. So the goal of the pricing is to increase our gross margin, okay, in which eventually will increase our profit. The three components of pricing price is retail cost markup, RCM. Okay, and remember that this RCM can be figured out in both dollars and percentages, and when they are in percentage, they are percent of retails. So cost percent, markup percent will be all percent of retails, and retail percent is always 100%. And this concludes Module 5 lecture. In this module, we've taken a look at the basics of markup, and in next few modules, we will learn more about different types of markups that we are sometimes asked to calculate as part of the business operation. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to work on module problem assignment number 5.